In 1967, America appeared to be a symbol of power, freedom, and democracy. But behind that polished image, a quiet fear was beginning to grow. Rising opposition to the Vietnam War, protests on university campuses, voices in the streets, and a rebellious generation forced Washington to confront a dangerous question. What if the enemy was not outside the borders, but inside the country itself? From that question emerged a secret operation the public was never meant to know. Operation Chaos. This was not a conventional intelligence mission. The CIA was legally restricted to foreign threats, yet now its focus was shifting inward. Inside closed White House meetings and classified briefings, anti-war movements were framed not as dissent, but as evidence of communist influence. Protest was no longer seen as opinion, it was treated as a threat. And at that moment, the decision was made. This would not be about discovering truth, but about maintaining control. Operation Chaos was built in total secrecy. No public authorization, no formal paper trail, only verbal directives and classified files. A special unit was created inside the CIA with a single objective: to monitor anti-war activists. Civil rights leaders, students, journalists, and even public figures. Names, contacts, habits, beliefs, everything was converted into data. An intelligence network spread across major American cities. Informants were planted inside university campuses. Undercover assets infiltrated protest groups, and phone calls, letters, and meetings were quietly monitored. All of it was justified under the banner of national security. But the real objective was to map fear itself: who was speaking, why they were speaking, and how much influence they could command. CIA analysts produced thousands of reports, yet a critical problem remained. There was no concrete evidence directly linking these movements to Soviet or communist control. Still, the operation did not slow down. Because Operation Chaos had evolved beyond facts, it had become a system driven by suspicion. If evidence could not be found, surveillance was expanded. If the threat was unclear, it was treated as inevitable. Over time, the mission began to cross its own boundaries. Citizens who were simply opposing a war were now classified as potential national security risks. Files grew thicker, watch lists expanded, and state power quietly tightened its grip around civil liberties. The first phase of Operation Chaos was complete. The surveillance infrastructure was in place. Fear had been institutionalized, and the CIA had entered a battlefield where the enemy wore no uniform, only ordinary clothes. But this was only the beginning. The real question was no longer whether a threat existed. It was how far this mission would go, and who would ultimately pay the price. Once the surveillance infrastructure was fully established, Operation Chaos moved into its next phase, and this step was far more dangerous than before. Information was no longer being collected for analysis alone. Decisions were now being built on that data. Inside the CIA, the debate over legality had quietly ended. The question had shifted to something more extreme. If we do not act, do we risk losing the country itself? Protest movements were no longer viewed individually. They were mapped as a single interconnected network. Civil rights groups, anti-war organizations, student movements, all were merged into the same intelligence framework. The distinction between peaceful dissent and extremism was erased. Anyone who challenged the system became part of the record. The CIA expanded covert coordination with the FBI, NSA, and local law enforcement agencies. Intelligence was shared, but accountability was deliberately blurred. It became a shadow network where every institution was involved, yet no single entity could be directly held responsible. Civil liberties still existed on paper, but in practice, they were steadily disappearing. Internal reports repeatedly reached the same conclusion: no direct foreign control could be proven. Yet Operation Chaos did not stop. Because the mission had evolved beyond searching for evidence, it had become about managing dissent. Opposition was now viewed as destabilization itself. At this stage, infiltration took a new form. Agents were no longer just observing. they were influencing. Internal conflicts were quietly fueled inside protest groups. Leadership was undermined, trust was weakened, and divisions were deliberately amplified. The objective was clear. If the movement could not be destroyed, it would be fragmented. Some activists suddenly faced tax investigations. Others encountered unexplained travel restrictions. Some quietly lost their jobs. These appeared to be isolated incidents, but inside classified files, they were recorded as coordinated outcomes of the same operation. The state did not confront its citizens openly, but its pressure was felt everywhere. Over time, unease began to grow inside the CIA itself. Some officers knew a line had been crossed. A retreat was no longer possible. Thousands of names, millions of data points, and years of surveillance had created a reality that now required its own operation to conceal. Operation Chaos was no longer just a covert mission. It had become a psychological battlefield, where the question was no longer who the enemy was, but who might be next. And at that moment, the operation entered its most dangerous phase yet. This was no longer just a surveillance operation. It had become a battle of concealment. As Operation Chaos expanded, its greatest threat no longer came from outside, but from within. The problem was not what was being collected. It was what would happen if it ever came to light. Thousands of American citizens, classified files, illegal surveillance, all of it had turned into a weight the state itself was now carrying. Internal reviews within the CIA began raising serious concerns. Reports quietly acknowledged that the operation had gone far beyond its original mandate. But these documents rarely traveled far. They were intercepted, redacted, softened, and stripped of dangerous language. The truth still existed, but only in fragments. At the same time, faint whispers began to surface in the media. Some journalists sensed that something abnormal was happening inside the government. But no one could assemble the full picture. Every source was incomplete. Every lead ended in a dead end. Operation Chaos was no longer targeting just citizens. It was shaping the flow of information itself. Protest movements had weakened, but they had not disappeared. They had become quieter, more cautious, and deeply suspicious. Every new face felt like a potential informant. Inside classified files, this was recorded as success. Dissent was no longer loud, but it was still alive and therefore still dangerous. For some CIA officers, this phase became impossible to ignore. They knew this was no longer a war against an enemy, but a profiling of their own society. Yet whistleblowing meant career destruction and possibly worse. Silence had become a form of survival. As the early 1970s arrived, the political climate began to shift. Public anger over the Vietnam War intensified. Pressure mounted on Congress to investigate intelligence agencies. This was the moment Operation CHAOS's architects feared most. Files began to move. Questions started being asked openly. And for the first time, there was a real risk that the operation would not remain buried forever. Operation Chaos was no longer just a secret program. It had become a liability, a burden that, if dropped, could shake the entire system. And this was the point where the end became inevitable. This was the stage where secrecy could no longer hold. This was the moment silence was about to break. By 1974, the political climate had completely shifted. The Watergate scandal had taught the American public that blind trust in power could be dangerous. Under mounting pressure, Congress launched investigations into intelligence agencies. For the first time, the focus was not on foreign enemies, but on domestic operations. As investigators reached the CIA, the shadow of Operation Chaos became impossible to ignore. The question was simple, yet explosive. The answer was already inside the files. When reports were presented to the Church Committee, the picture became clear. Thousands of names appeared: students, journalists, professors, anti-war activists. No proven crimes, no formal charges, only potential threat. That alone had been enough. The CIA defended itself, claiming national security concerns and foreign influence risks. But Congress was unconvinced. The law was clear. The CIA had no authority to conduct such operations inside the United States. Operation Chaos was officially terminated. Files were sealed. Some documents were destroyed. Others remain classified to this day. No agents went to prison. No senior officials were convicted. The mission ended. Accountability did not arrive. Many of those surveilled were never fully informed. Some later discovered their names in reports. Others never knew at all. The trust that was broken was never fully restored. Operation Chaos drew a line in U.S. intelligence history. Oversight committees were strengthened, legal boundaries were reinforced, and on paper, safeguards were established to prevent repetition. But paper and reality are not always the same. This operation left behind a lasting lesson. When the enemy is undefined, power often turns inward. Operation Chaos was shut down, but the question remains, who decides the line between security and freedom? This was not just the story of a secret operation. It was a story of power, fear, and control. If you want to explore the hidden chapters of history that never make it into textbooks, stay connected with our channel. This video is based on historical research, declassified records, and credible journalistic sources. The intent is educational and informational. No individual or institution is targeted for defamation.